Val's incredible credentials here. Val is an OSCE Special Representative and Coordinator for Combating Trafficking in Human Beings. He represents the OSCE at the political level on anti-trafficking issues and assists the 57 participating states developing and implementing anti-trafficking strategies and initiatives. Val travels all over the world in his work, and before joining the OSCE, Val worked for 13 years as a prosecutor in Seattle, handling sexual assault, child exploitation, and human trafficking cases. Val has a Bachelor of Arts and Master of Arts in Political Science from Boston University and a Juris Doctor from the University of Washington. And today we are going to be talking about this report, which was just issued in July, Discouraging the Demand. So we're going to be talking about the Johns and the demand side of trafficking. So Val, thank you so much again for being here today.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot for having me.
Val, can you tell us a little bit about this research, including, what's it about and why is this research important now, today?
Well, I think that let me start with what it's about and then move to why I think it's important. But what we do in the research is to look at the issue of demand as it relates to human trafficking. And by demand, what we're talking about are activities that result in the purchase of services from trafficking victims or incentivize traffickers to traffic. And specifically what we're talking about is the purchase of sexual services, which could be from trafficking victims or might not be, but certainly are incentivizing to traffickers to do what they do because they think they can put their victims into the prostitution marketplace and make a lot of money off of it. And in fact, they're right. So what we wanted to do was look at this problem from the international perspective and look at what international obligations and commitments exist in this realm. Look at how countries have responded to those obligations in the criminal justice sphere. So how have they tried to criminalize different aspects of demand and sort of what are the pros and cons of those different approaches? And then look at also how they have engaged in efforts to prevent or to reduce demand through prevention initiatives, because there's a whole bunch of tools that they can use on that regard. And then to offer some sort of thoughts about those different interventions, and pros and cons, and some suggestions for how they might improve their work. Why I think it's important, there's several reasons, but I'll highlight a couple. The first is that, as I've already alluded to, trafficking is a financially motivated crime, particularly trafficking for sexual exploitation. And it's a hugely profitable. The estimates are that trafficking for sexual exploitation generates about $100 billion a year, which is more than the Apple Corporation, to put it into perspective. It's a massive business, and that amount, according to the estimates, has quintupled since in the last 15 years. And so what we want to do is to try to encourage countries to undermine that financial incentive of trafficking, the idea that you can make lots and lots of money by putting people out there for exploitation, by addressing the source of that money. Because while that $100 billion is paid to traffickers, it's paid by sex buyers who are paying to have sex with trafficking victims, whether they know it or not. The second reason that we think it's important is to address the harm that comes from all of this. And what I mean by that is that traffickers inflict harm on victims because they think they can earn money off of them. So in that regard, men who are purchasing sex from trafficking victims or incentivizing traffickers to do what they do are a direct cause of that harm because they're fueling the incentive of traffickers to use force, fraud, and coercion on victims. But also, there's a second aspect to this harm, and this is one that is often not mentioned very much, which is that buyers are directly inflicting harm on trafficking victims in a couple ways. First of all, that a trafficking victim hasn't come to that transaction voluntarily, right? By definition, their will has been overcome. They have been coerced or forced into that transaction. So when men have sex with them, it's non-consensual sex, tantamount to rape. And I think we don't sort of put those two things together, that buying sex from trafficking victims doesn't just fuel exploitation, it is exploitation. That's a crucial point to understand. Additionally, buyers, we know, often inflict violence, and we can talk a little bit more about that, but they often inflict violence as part of the prostitution transaction, which is very, very harmful. A third reason to address demand is that we know that trafficking for sexual exploitation disproportionately affects women and girls to the tune of 90% or more of identified victims are women and girls. But also, in particular, it intersects with other aspects, other vulnerabilities, including racial and ethnic minorities. So what we know, for example, is that those women and girls are also disproportionately minority women and girls. And maybe this is a topic we can also explore in a few minutes. And so addressing demand can help combat that aspect of trafficking. And the final reason I think it's really crucial is that it's an untapped resource. Countries, by and large, have not been very proactive on addressing demand, and demand is really effective. Addressing demand side is really effective in other areas, for example, trafficking for labor exploitation. So we should be applying that same strategy here and using it as one of the tools in our toolbox.
Do you have any insights from your work and your research about why states and governments may be so hesitant to address the demand side or the Johns when it comes to human trafficking?
Well, I think there's probably a whole bunch of reasons for it. One of those is that I think law enforcement has often viewed the traffickers as the primary sort of harm causer in this whole situation. So they've been triaging on the trafficker side and not addressing the demand side because they view their job, they're under-resourced, the scale of the problem is massive, and so they're just going after the traffickers. What's interesting about that, though, is that when you talk to survivors, they often tell you how much they hated and were abused by their buyers. And so one of the things I think we could do to encourage more action on demand is listen a bit more to the survivors and victims of this crime, because they're the ones who have actually experienced that harm and will very clearly identify buyers as being a source of that harm. I think another reason is that there's been a lot of confusion around prostitution generally, and particularly in the United States right now, there's quite a large debate around prostitution, and that has paralyzed a bit the efforts to address demand. I think, unfortunately so, because you don't need necessarily to resolve that prostitution conversation to address the massive problem of men buying sex from trafficking victims. There's a whole lot we could do around that without necessarily having to resolve each and every debate. Second of all, I think that debate has been skewed a little bit in terms of an emphasis around decriminalizing prostitution, but not acknowledging that a lot of those efforts to decriminalize prostitution also mean decriminalize buying. And we know from evidence and from international police agencies and law enforcement and research that if you do that, you tend to open the market for traffickers. You tend to give them a cover for their activities to allow them to present their trafficking activities as legitimate activities. And thereby, actually, you see increased flows of trafficking into systems that decriminalize buying and pimping. So that's something we want to be very, very careful of, that we don't want to actually encourage more exploitation while we're trying to have less of it.
Right, absolutely. You had talked about the Johns and some of the behaviors that you see that are common among them. Are there any characteristics that are common to Johns, or any way we can understand them as a group, or is it really a lot more complicated than that?
Well, I think there's some characteristics and there's some trends, but I'll also speak about why I think we need a lot more information on that. First of all, they're male. I think this is important. I mean, undoubtedly, and we know from anecdotal evidence, there are female buyers out there, but female buyers are not what's propping up the trafficking industry. at any kind of volume that compares to men buying sex. So that's certainly not the issue. But it's important to recognize that demand is male-driven, and therefore strategies and tactics and interventions need to take that into account and need to really focus on what is it about male behavior that's contributing to this, because it's pretty widespread. However, at the same time, it is not inherent to men that this happens. And what I mean by that is that 85% of men in the world do not buy sex. So it's really important to kind of recognize that it is a characteristic, it's a behavior, but it's not an inherent or inevitable behavior. And I think that's important. Second of all, we know that unlike the racial disproportionality among victims, buyers tend to be disproportionately white. There were some studies a few years ago that showed that, for example, men who buy sex online are 85% white. Also, that they tend to be employed because they need money to buy, and they tend to skew towards the higher income brackets. And there's been quite a lot of work that has shown this time and time again. That doesn't mean that people in lower income brackets don't buy sex. It means that they tend to be skewed in that direction. In my own experience, what I can also say, having arrested or prosecuted many, many men trying to buy sex from children in particular, is that time and time again, we saw abuse of pornography in their history as being a contributing factor to what they were doing. They cited it in their interviews a lot. They discussed it over and over again. And I can't say, not being a psychologist, I can't speak to whether there's cause and effect there, but there's certainly a correlation that we saw it present in the men who we were arresting, particularly around men trying to buy sex from younger people, that this was a common feature of it. That being said, there's a lot we don't know about the motivations of sex buyers or what is leading them to do what they do. Because I think it is, in my experience, again, it's much more complicated than to say, they're just looking for sexual gratification. Because what we have found in our interviews with them over and over again was that, yes, that's where it starts, or that's what they initially say, but if you burrow a little bit deeper, it was because they felt that sexual gratification was going to solve other problems in their life. And time and time again, they were disappointed to figure out that did not happen. And so they were trying to feel better by buying more, and then it led into kind of a cycle. And so those are some initial observations.
Val, you had mentioned a few minutes ago the men who tend to buy sex are white. The women who are trafficked tend to be girls and women from minority communities who are not white. How do you think about that? What do you take away from that kind of dynamic?
Well, when I was prosecuting, it was we started collecting some data, and we were looking at child victims of trafficking that we had identified and worked with, and we had hundreds over the years. And what we found is that 48% of those children were Black. I don't just mean all minority categories, just Black. And in the jurisdiction I worked in, only 7% of the population was Black. Meanwhile, 78% of the men trying to buy sex from children were white, which was also disproportionately high. I think the rate in that area was in the high 60s. So, 48% of the victims are Black and 7% of the population. To me, that is shocking disproportionality. That's not just a little tick one way or the other. That is very, very indicative of racial discrimination, and I would say a culture around turning a blind eye towards the exploitation of minority women and girls through prostitution or through trafficking. And my sense is that is a totally unacceptable system and must be dismantled in every way possible, beginning with the men who are paying to have sex with those people, especially because they're, as I said before, if they're children or exploited adults, are coming to that transaction without consent, without voluntariness of any kind. So for me, I think this racial disproportionality in the commercial sex industry at large and in trafficking is a fundamental issue to address if the United States is interested in honestly and comprehensively addressing racial equity and gender equality.
Now we're starting to get some questions in from our audience who are really interested in your insights here. We have one attendee who asks, how do we help educate local law enforcement to understand what human trafficking truly is?
Well, I think, as I suggested before, one of the ways is to bring survivors into the conversation a lot more, and to have them talk about their experience, not only from their trafficker, but also from the men who abuse them through sex purchasing. That's time and time again, I saw survivors turn the light switch on for policymakers, for law enforcement, for whoever, when they talked about their experiences and saw the audience listening to that and realizing what it was that needed to be done. And that can be very motivating. The second thing, I think we need to be sharing some of the practices that are useful in combating demand with law enforcement in a more systematic way. I used to do a lot of speeches around the US trying to share what we were working on, how we did it, how we failed, and sharing those success stories and those failures with folks really helps them then mobilize in a way that will be useful. That was our goal through this paper, was to talk about some of those interventions and where we saw the pros and cons. So we, for example, discussed different types of statutes and identify which ones are good or not so useful in combating demand, or different types of interventions. But time and time again, what we came across is that jurisdictions may have good statutes and they're just not implementing. And so it's really a question of will. And the way we can build will is by telling the story, by showing them what it really means, and by bringing a bit of humanity to the whole discussion.
That's really helpful. And I'll also note to our audience that groups like Anti-Trafficking International, who are hosting this webinar series, have a lot of survivor volunteers who can tell just that sort of story and engage in that education initiative. So thank you very much for that. We have another question from our audience. How do you recommend, are there best practices or tools that you can recommend for tracking the traffickers, and through that work, identifying the Johns to connect to the buyers?
Well, I think that a lot more can be done in the law enforcement. I don't know the background of the person asking the question, but a lot more can be done from the law enforcement perspective. And one of the things that we talk about in this paper is that time and time again, law enforcement will find or identify a victim of trafficking. We'll start talking to them. The victim being, having been sort of brainwashed by traffickers over time, may not be real or fearful or traumatized, may not want to share their perspective right away, and may need time to do that. And oftentimes law enforcement sort of stops there instead of talking with them about the men that abuse them in the context of being exploited. And what we have seen is that law enforcement agencies that spend a little bit of time talking with victims about buyers and who was violent towards them or who abused them tend to make a lot of progress there. Those are the people that victims often really do want to talk about. Additionally, they can do investigation by looking at through traffickers or victims' phones to identify the buyers, because that's how they're connecting, or through social media accounts and so forth. There's a whole bunch of options for law enforcement to go and identify buyers and then set up operations to grab them. Yet those aren't being used. What's happening is an interview of a victim. The victim may or may not cooperate, and then they sort of go after the trafficker or don't. And that's the end of the story. And we discuss that there's a lot of opportunities to do that. For people other than law enforcement, I want to really caution against people trying to get too involved in this on their own, because this is a violent world. it's a world that can get pretty dicey pretty quickly. And also there's a lot of shame around some of the behavior, and people don't react well when they're confronted on this. So I would probably encourage folks to leave the identification and the confrontation of buyers to law enforcement. However, I do think the public can raise a lot of awareness around this, to talk to each other. Men should be talking to men about this behavior. We should be educating our children in schools about healthy relationships, about consent, about mutuality and respect. Those are very, very important ways that we can sort of undermine the negative stereotypes that lead to eventually men growing up and becoming older and engaging in a lot of harmful activity.
That's great. Thank you, Val. I don't think the aspect of respect for others and respect for self can be underplayed. I mean, that's just so important for that kind of confidence and respect for each other. That's so essential to protecting people long term. Another question that we have from our audience, and I'm going to try to kind of interpret this a bit because it feels like a really big question. Do you think there is more opportunity, just kind of globally speaking, of countries acting on demand side in country, or do you think more work and more focus needs to be done between countries and in partnerships between countries to fight the demand side?
I think definitely a lot more needs to be done domestically. There is absolutely a problem of sex tourism, particularly the abuse of children. And a lot of organizations have been raising good awareness around this. Some countries have been taking good action on it. The United States, for example, has done some work around the International Megan's Law and other sex tourism initiatives. And here I really want to commend Representative Chris Smith, who's been very, very proactive on this, including now leading efforts on the TVPA. However, I think that is a smaller slice of the overall demand issue, and most demand as it manifests in the actual purchase and sexual transaction is going to be in the country. And so those are the transactions we can work to discourage or to disrupt or to hold people accountable who are not discouraged or disrupted. And therefore a lot more needs to be done domestically. I think it's important to just step back for a second and appreciate the scale of what we're talking about here. When I say $100 billion a year in profits, what I'm talking about is, let's say on average, just on average, and it depends on the transaction, it depends on the country. On average, $100 a transaction. We are talking about 1 billion transactions of men paying for sex with trafficking victims per year. 1 billion. That is not, I'm not even talking about prostitution and whether you want to argue on whether that's consensual or not. We're not even having that conversation. We are talking specifically about purchase of sex from trafficking victims, 1 billion transactions a year. So we are talking about a massive cultural problem, which requires a holistic response. And we're not going to get there through sort of one-off arrests or an awareness campaign on a billboard. We're talking about really needing to invest in this. I did see one question pop up that was, what was the TBBA? What I was saying was the TVPA, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which is the major legislation in the United States to authorize funding for and various initiatives to combat trafficking. And every couple of years it gets reauthorized, and right now it's being considered by Congress for reauthorization. Sorry about that acronym.
Well, thank you very much for that clarification. How is America doing in its fight against trafficking?
America, I mean, so for those of you that don't know the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation is a group of 57 countries from North America, Canada, the United States, all the way through Europe to Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, Russia, and so forth. So we work with a huge number of countries. And what I can say is I've been to many of those countries and in my work, and the United States is doing very well in terms of investment, in terms of laws and policies, in terms of some of the most committed and active frontline responders. The challenging part of this is that in the United States, just like every other country in the OSCE, we are not defeating trafficking. And that's a really crucial thing to point out. The US is generating a lot of activity on combating trafficking, but we're not winning. And so I think we need to shift our whole mindset around not counting activities, not counting arrests or counting initiatives or counting necessarily dollars, and change our mindset towards what is it going to take to substantively stop this problem. In the same way, for example, that 150 years ago, we decided as a country, over time, and it wasn't all that easy, to stop slavery. What is it going to take to actually stop this problem, to say that sexual exploitation in America is not permitted? And then let's work backwards from that and build the strategy that we need. Let me give you an example. In my old jurisdiction, there were 13 anti-drug task force and 1 on human trafficking. Human trafficking generates almost as much money as drug trafficking globally, but the investment in combating trafficking is a tiny, tiny fraction of what we spend on other major problems. So what we need to do is scale up that response dramatically. There should be a massive, massive holistic societal response to actually solve this problem, and we haven't seen that yet. So US is doing well, but not nearly enough to actually put a dent in the larger problem.
I think one of the counter arguments that we sometimes hear when it comes to new policies to fight human trafficking is, well, if you take this action over here, it'll just squish over into another area. For example, if you institute penalties or stronger enforcement in one state or country, it'll just shift over to another one, and the buyers and the trafficking activity will just go there. We saw that a lot online too. Like if you start shutting down these online buying sites, it'll just move on to another site. So it's almost like what's the point? How do you think about, as you talk to people and hear those kinds of arguments, what do you say to people who are thinking that way?
Well, if I thought, what's the point, I would just go home and take a nap and have a cup of tea and call it good, but that's obviously not possible. So what I would say is, when you tell me that when you institute new laws and you tell me that you institute some enforcement of those and some awareness campaigns and it pushes it to another jurisdiction, you know what I think? I think it's working, right? That tells me that demand is not inevitable, that demand can be addressed, and that in fact, the oldest profession, as it's often said, is not actually that, but in fact is something that we can end if we choose to. So that's the first thing I take away. The second thing I take away is I would quarrel a little bit with your characterization around the websites, because what's interesting about what happened on those websites is Backpage was taken down, and yes, there was some movement in the market, but overall, the size of the market reduced significantly. And what it did is it put friction in the marketplace in a very, very disruptive way. And what I see from that is that buyers and traffickers rely very much on stable and consistent and efficient marketplaces. And if you disrupt those marketplaces, it disrupts the efficiency there. And the higher you make that friction in the marketplace, the higher the threshold for buyers to enter the market. The easier it is, the more buyers will enter. And that's what happened with tech, is it became really, really easy and the market expanded. But as we disrupt it, the market contracts because there's a higher threshold to get involved. So yes, some of the traffic spread, but overall, there is no comparable central hub of exploitation like there was with Backpage. There's nothing even approaching 5 or 10% of the size of Backpage, which means the market is very disrupted. And that makes it harder for the sale and exploitation of human beings. And that's kind of how we need to think about demand more broadly, is we need to put friction in the marketplace. We need to demonstrate more broadly that it's completely unacceptable, and to demonstrate a sort of cultural inhospitability towards the problem.
Bill, you had mentioned earlier in your remarks that people who buy sex, there also tends to be a violence that goes along with that, a physical violence, in addition to the emotional trauma that goes along with it. Why is that? how have you come to understand that as part of the behavior or characteristics of the buyers?
Well, first of all, let's talk a little bit about what I mean when I'm talking about violence. So there's some good studies that show that, for example, the most common perpetrator of violence in a trafficking situation is the buyer. Let me just say that again. The most common perpetrator of violence in that system of sexual exploitation is the buyer, not the trafficker. So what we found time and time again, in both in talking to survivors, but also in the research, is that, and one good example was that people in prostitution experienced violence. 67% came from unfamiliar buyers, 7% came from buyers, and only 5% from pimps. So what's interesting about that, first of all, is the familiar buyers. There's often this claim, well, the good buyers are okay. It's just the bad ones we have to worry about. But that's not how it works. A good, quote, good buyer can turn into a bad buyer anytime. And we've seen a lot of homicides this way, where somebody ends up murdering women or girls who had been, quote, a good buyer. And so I think that we have to dismantle that idea pretty quickly. The second thing is that, as I said before, if you talk with survivors, they will tell you time and time again how much violence comes from buyers and how much the trauma that they experienced in trafficking was caused by or was amplified by buyers. I think that really helps us understand how bad this problem is. Why do I think that is? I think it's because in our experience working with the men who buy sex, and I'm talking about buying generally or buying from exploited people or buying from children, in our experience, many of them are coming to that place with a lot of their own sort of baggage, whether it's trauma, whether it's anger, whether it's frustrations, whether it's shame, and then they act it out on what they perceive to be a legitimate target. If they are paying for sex with somebody, they perceive that person to be a legitimate target for all of that frustration and all of that violence, all of that anger. And we just see that played out over and over again. So again, I think we need a lot more research on this issue, on the motivations of buyers and why, and the level of violence and why they do that. But that's been our experience working with the psychologists who had been assigned to support buyers who we had arrested and were prosecuting.
That's really helpful. I will note to our audience, several of you have asked where, for the link to the research from OSCE. I did drop that into the chat, so you can get a direct link to that research and see all the great work that has gone into these studies and these remarks. So Val, as you have many, many years at this point of talking with governments and states and doing this research and prosecuting on human trafficking. Is there anything that makes you feel optimistic about where we're headed on the issue of human trafficking?
Well, I'm always optimistic. I think I think what we've learned is that there are a whole bunch of tools that we can use to address demand, that a lot of those tools can work if properly deployed, if evaluated, if carefully considered, and so forth. And so that, again, gives me great optimism that if we can scale those interventions, if we can harmonize them and build them in a more holistic fashion, that we can really have an impact here. And so, what makes me excited is the idea that we actually have options to fundamentally reduce or end trafficking for sexual exploitation. That's exciting. And so the strategy, I think, is there. It exists. We need to take it on and then start to implement it. But I am heartened by the fact that I think those things exist. I don't see this as a problem with no solution. I see this as a problem whose solution hasn't been fully taken on or implemented yet. And this is why I think we are, in general, heading towards a place where we can have a lot of good impact. And I hope the paper contributes to that.
I certainly think it will. And I know that you've gotten a lot of great interest in your research. Can you tell us a little bit about how your research has been received?
Yeah, I mean, it's been very interesting because we work with a lot of countries who have taken a variety of approaches on this issue. Everything from, criminalizing everything to criminalizing nothing or very little. And so we have to meet countries where they are. They have the right to choose their policies, although there are some restrictions. For example, the international convention that applies, or treaty that applies to trafficking, is called the Palermo Protocol, at least in colloquial terms. And that Palermo Protocol actually requires all of the countries, over 170 countries in the world, requires them to take action on demand. And a lot of countries forget that piece of it. So we want to remind them that they have an international legal obligation to address demand. The second thing, though, is that we're very excited because we're seeing a number of countries that haven't done too much on demand, maybe in the past, starting to take action, including some of those countries that had tested out, I think, a different model around prostitution, whether legalization or decriminalization, are starting to see that they need to take some action to try to address demand in order to really address the trafficking problem that they have. In particular, we've seen the European Union launch several efforts now specifically oriented around addressing demand because of the realization that this is really a fundamental piece. Several countries in the European Union who previously had not taken a lot of action are now starting to adopt laws or tweak their laws around demand and to enhance their attention to demand. So I think this is very, very promising. We haven't seen quite as much of that ambition in the United States, although there is a pretty good framework already. We'd just like to see a little bit more implementation.
Now that you've done this research, having talked to a lot of researchers, I know that once they finish a project, it tends to, open up new questions of thought and areas of thought for them. What are you thinking about focusing on next? Has this opened up new ideas and new things that you want to look into?
Well, the first thing that we're working on is trying to help countries incorporate some of these recommendations from the report into their work. And there's a couple different ways that we're doing that. Some countries need to take some initial steps through their parliaments, so to adopt the laws that are necessary, and we're supporting them in that regard. Others need to implement their laws or to be a little bit more operational around their laws, and so there we're supporting them around their national action plans, for example, to incorporate these elements into those action plans, and then also supporting them with some workshops so that they can understand what their options are a little bit better. So we're really trying to turn a paper, so it doesn't just sit on the bookshelf and gather dust, so that we can turn it into implementation. And that's one of the big things. In parallel, though, with that is that we're doing a lot of work around understanding vulnerabilities of victims on the other side of that. And we did some work earlier this year around applying gender-sensitive approaches in combating trafficking. So really understanding better how different types of victims are affected differently. And although women and girls are disproportionately impacted in trafficking for sexual exploitation, it might be men and boys in other areas, or it might also be men and boys in sexual exploitation. And we need to be ready to account for that and to help those victims so that nobody's left behind. We also are now looking at the intersection of minority status and how that plays into this, which is very, very interesting, because what we've seen in every country, the minorities who are disproportionately affected by trafficking might be different, but they're always present, right? And so it doesn't matter what country you go to, sort of the poorest and most marginalized people are often the ones who end up getting exploited. And now in 2022, what we're looking at is to launch a bit of research around exploitation of people with disabilities, because we've seen cases all over the OSCE region of people being exploited in a whole bunch of different ways who had either mental or physical disabilities. And we want to highlight this aspect because it also raises a lot of assistance questions, like how do you best serve those populations? And we want to bring some attention to that issue.
That's really great. Looking forward to hearing a lot more about that. A late breaking question from one of our audience members is, As you have engaged policymakers around the world on the issue of human trafficking, have you come into instances where you suspect or you know for a fact that policymakers are unwilling to engage because they themselves may be a buyer and they just don't understand the perspective from the person who's being trafficked?
Well, it's a very interesting question. What I have found is that nobody supports human trafficking, right? There's no pro-human trafficking lobby out there. People are all against human trafficking. What becomes more difficult is that buyers often think they are not contributing to human trafficking. They like to believe that they are just buying sex from somebody who wants to be doing it, and in fact, they're being really nice to that person, and of course, everything's fine. The reality is that that's absolutely not true. And so buyers are ignoring all of the signs. They are doing, the things they're doing anyway. Time and time again, we've seen research or personal experience through the law enforcement system that buyers are unmotivated or unwilling or unable to identify exploitation in their purchases. And we know this because they make 1 billion purchases a year from trafficking victims, and they all allege that they never do that. So of course that happens, and it's a major, major problem. I am 100% sure I have spoken with men who have bought sex. It's everywhere. And I'm sure also that they did not think of themselves as contributing to human trafficking. And that disconnect is really important, that we confront that and dismantle that, because those two things are intimately connected. And either they bought sex from a trafficking victim, or the fact that they're buying sex is incentivizing traffickers to put people who are victimized into the marketplace. Either way, it's a major problem, and it's just chock full of risk. So, for example, we've talked to a lot of companies about this problem because we've found that many companies have people in their employment who are buying sex including from trafficking victims. And what we suggest to them is that they take a fairly strong stance on developing a good code of conduct on this, because the risk of somebody in their employment going out and buying sex from a trafficking victim is high. There's absolutely no way for the buyer to know whether it's a trafficking victim. And so it's a much better risk management tactic to just not be buying sex at all. And that's what we've seen some companies take that up, and that's excellent. That's one of the cultural norms that we need to develop to stop this problem.
One more audience question. Do you have a sense of the percentage of people who are a missing person and people who may be being trafficked? Is there kind of a sense of what the scale of that is, what the relationship is between those two groups?
That's a tough question. I mean, it's definitely a factor. For example, children, high number of exploited children are also missing. I'm not sure we can say that a high number of missing children are exploited, although I would say probably it's the case. It would be mostly a guess. But we do know from working with exploited children that a lot of them, have gone missing at some point and are being exploited. Let me say, though, that anytime you make a statement like that, then you have to caveat it by saying, and there's a lot of exploited children who are in school, who are talking to their friends, who we just don't know that they're being exploited because they don't talk about it, or they don't have the support system to get them through that. And so I don't think we can draw any conclusive assumptions that trafficked kids are only missing, or something else. That being said, what we do know is that a massive correlation on exploited children is involvement with the criminal justice or welfare system. And if they're involved with the welfare system, for example, some data we had from my old jurisdiction was that they, on average, exploited children or trafficked children had something like 27 placements in their life as part of the context surrounding their exploitation. That's incredibly unstable. and obviously very, very conducive to bad things happening to them.
One follow-up question from our audience. You had mentioned that some businesses are making it a formal policy against sex trafficking among their leadership, their employees. Is there any sort of formal coalition or group of companies or any public pledges that companies have made that our audience can take a look at or think about?
Well, in the paper, we have a whole section around codes of conduct. And so you can take a look at that. And we cite a couple good examples, like Amazon, one of the largest companies in the world, has a very, very strong policy. I want to emphasize that a policy doesn't mean you stop it. You really have to educate, engage people on that policy, train them, and so forth. So I don't want companies to think that they can just adopt a policy and, you know, it's all good. You really need to engage people with the intent to actually stop harm. This isn't a bad thing to do. It's about stopping harm. There's also an NGO that we used to work with called Businesses Ending Slavery and Trafficking that does a lot of work with businesses around training employees to watch out for this kind of thing, supporting them around codes of conduct, and so forth. There are also a number of private sector coalitions working on this issue. For example, the Tech Coalition or Tech Against Trafficking are two separate entities that are working a lot around dealing with trying to either combat online child exploitation or use their resources to harness the positive use of technology to help combat trafficking. So there's a lot of different options out there, and we discuss a few of those in this paper and also in a paper that's about to be released around technology facilitated trafficking, which I'm very excited about and discusses a lot of the ways that the private sector and the countries have tried to adopt policies or approaches to deal with tech-facilitated trafficking. I think it's going to be a really interesting read at this moment in time when we know that tech is being misused so broadly.
That's great. We're in just our last few minutes here of the webinar. I know that there are probably a lot more questions out there that people have. We'll just note, please check the OSCE resources that have been dropped in the chat for Val's paper and more resources from this excellent organization. I will also note that this event is being recorded and will be posted on Anti-Trafficking International's YouTube site. So you'll be able to reference that very soon, and we'll send out a note with a link to that directly. But just to close this out here, Val, I'd love your one final thought on this is, you know, if folks could walk away from today's webinar knowing one thing, what's the most important thing you want them to know?
There's a great group that I became aware of that was called Men Can Stop Rape. And their sort of whole start of their conversation was around the best way to stop rape is don't rape. I know it sounds kind of trite, but in fact, it's dead simple. And the way that we can stop sex trafficking is by not buying sex. So I think it's a pretty simple concept and one that anybody in the community can take on and can engage those around them in discussing this and just creating the norms. And we don't have to do it in a strange or weird way. We can just say this isn't really something that we agree with, and nobody that when we're around, nobody should be doing that. And I think that is the start to the kind of cultural change that we eventually will need to see. The second maybe thing I would say is trafficking for sexual exploitation is entirely solvable. It's entirely solvable. We just have to stop paying for it. And this is really, really crucial to recognize that unlike lots of other things in the world, tornadoes, you know, whatever, that we have no control over, we can stop this. And so I would encourage everybody to take that mindset on and to bring an ambitious spirit to it. And I think we can make some real progress.
Well, that is a very hopeful note for us to end on. I will take that optimism and your resilience and strength. Val Richey, thank you so much for being here today. Really insightful and great resources. To our audience, thank you for being here today and for being super engaged in this. Again, please visit osce.org for more information, and ATI's website at antitraffickinginternational.org. We'll be sending an email with more resources so you can learn more about this and get more statistics. So thank you all for being here and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you all. Take care.